Hi, I'm going to do a few videos on drawing, some drawing tutorials, where I'm going to be going into some real basic things about trying to draw more accurately in proportion. Some things that I've been working on. I got to a point where I really was feeling frustrated with my ability to look at something and replicate it in accurate proportions, even though I've been doing that kind of stuff for a long time. I'm going to do, there's this just a drawing of a door. It's kind of things I've been sort of working on. And I'm eventually going to be working on just something extremely simple like this, and to really just come up with some strategies to hopefully make the idea of drawing something this basic in proportions, and being in charge of that, whether I'm drawing it at a really small size or a really large size. So I'm going to be doing a series of videos on that. And the first thing I'm going to start out with is the idea of a square. Pretty exciting stuff, I know. But to make sure that we're all on the same page, a square is a rectangle with two pairs of parallel lines, one vertical and one horizontal. And when I'm thinking of squares and other rectangles, I'm going to start relating other rectangles to how they would relate to a square. For example, if I had a rectangle like that, I would imagine that as being a little more than one square tall. And I'm not being real exact yet. I'll get there. But if I had something like this, I would think of that as being almost 3 squares wide. So basically I'm thinking of something that is square, whether it is that size overall, or if it's a smaller square or a smaller square or a larger square. I'm still thinking about the idea that every time I'm drawing a square, I know that the distance of the horizontal edges should be the same length as the vertical edges. And there's ways of checking that I'm sort of going to go into. But another thing I'm going to think about is the fact that for any rectangle, you can think of the proportions of that rectangle both in the sense of how tall it is to how wide it is, and if those are the same, or if, for example, they're different. And I'm also going to be using the idea that the diagonal line that would connect two corner points, opposite corner points. Will be at the same tilt regardless of the overall size of the square. And this is all assuming that I'm talking about rectangles and squares straight up and down. So I'm looking at this square, and I'm looking at this angle. It seems to me that one edge might be a touch different than the other. So I'm going to use my pencil as a measuring tool. And yeah, it seems like this should really be more out here to make it square. And one way I can sort of tell that is just by thinking about the two right triangles that are created when I do this diagonal of a square. And when I think about imagining something like this, it helps. I'm thinking about three different things. I'm trying to think about what's the length of this edge compared to this edge, as well as does that right triangle seem like it could be the arrowhead of a, or the head of an arrow, and have these two sides be exactly symmetrical mirror images of each other. And so that was not, but then I can sort of get a better sense and adjust it like that. So I try to think of, especially if I'm trying to sort of imagine something as square, I'm thinking about that kind of triangle, which I think is a rotated isosceles triangle. I'm not trying to get too, but it helps me just sort of gauge if I'm sort of on the right track. When I think about if I'm starting a rectangle with that distance and that distance, if I draw the connect the diagonal for those two edges, I can kind of tell that that doesn't make an exact even triangle. I can tell that if I wanted to do that this would have to come a little bit further out here. That would be there. So I'm thinking about this, this, and this. Hold that thought. And what I'm going to do now is relate that idea to instead of thinking of the rectangle first, I'm just going to think of 2 points that are not directly above each other or side to side from each other. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage my sort of ability to kind of think of things in squares, as well as the ability to imagine fairly accurately and check and adjust a line that would be straight up and down, and a line that would be straight side to side. And I'm not drawing the lines. What I'm starting out with is just these, some crosshairs here. And I'm going to imagine how, if I started coming down here and was looking over here and thinking about this one coming over here, where they would intersect with each other, where they would cross. And from that, I'm going to connect those and then think of this as a right triangle, straight up and down, straight horizontal, and this line from here to here, this diagonal. And then I'm going to complete this other point over here, this other implied point that would complete this as a rectangle. Do the same idea. Make a couple crosshair points. Give myself a target. And now I'm looking at this particular rectangle, and I try to break things down. Typically for my students, if it seems as though something is 1 square wide, if it seems it's two squares wide, I should say 2 squares wide or tall is what I was. And if it's somewhere in here, for now I'm just going to think of it as in between 1 and 2 squares. And if it's somewhere over here, I'm going to think of it as just more than 2. This is just all very to get in the ballpark sort of thing. Oop. So if I was thinking of a rectangle that was taller than it was wide, if the rectangle was this tall, I'd say it's more than 1 square tall, but it's not quite. It's in between 1 and 2 squares. And I can tell that pretty quickly. You'll practice that and just sort of think about a rectangle that's either basically 2 squares tall or 2 squares wide, and notice that I'm changing around the actual overall dimensions, but the proportions of these rectangles close enough for now, but is the important thing. So I'm thinking about this is 2 squares wide. I could have something that's 2 squares wide on the order of this overall size, or that, or smaller, etc. So I try to think about, is it something 1 square or 2 squares or in between or more? Because a lot of times this is going to get to thinking about imagining the point from here to here, for example, or the point from here to here, or the point from here to here, or the point from here to here. And I'm going to start thinking of all of these things in terms of, first, these diagonal points, and if I can imagine the rectangle that those 2 points make as being either square, a little taller than a square, a little wider than a square, and if so, how much? Is it between 1 and 2 squares tall, or 1 and 2 squares wide? For example, this is going to be more than 2 squares tall. This right here is going to be more than 2 squares wide, and I'm just going real quick with that, and that seems pretty close to a square. That seems like it's more than 1 square, but not quite 2 squares. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about for any rectangle. So part of the point is that what I'm not doing is using this and this marking and doing that sort of thing. But I'm just trying to initially just think of these rectangles with a certain angle between the 2 diagonal points and the rectangle that they would imply. So what I want you to do is just get a piece of scratch paper and practice nothing more than placing 2 dots on a piece of paper, points, imagining where a guide mark would be if I dropped a line straight down from the higher one, straight across, and then complete, for now, just a right triangle. I would say you could complete the whole rectangle. Yeah, maybe I should have said complete the whole rectangle, because I want to relate it back to this idea of, is it 1 squares? So I'd say that's that's in between 1 and 2 squares tall. And if I finish this one, I'd say that's in between 1 and 2 squares, just wide. So that's a little wider than it is tall. And even just sort of starting off with that, I'm finding to be extremely helpful when I'm trying to draw something with points all over the place that I'm trying to get accurate and draw accurate. And once again, use the idea that it's pretty easy, it's pretty doable to check and correct to see if your horizontal line is actually horizontal by checking it with the top of the paper, which you can't actually see right now, for horizontal, or this thing came shifting on me, or vertical compared to the edges of the paper, as well as just sort of holding up your pencil and being able to look at something and say, hey, that seems straight across, and that's straight up and down. Finish this one off. So that seems pretty close to 2 squares wide. I'm just sort of guessing at that. Maybe I'll kind of check, because I know that a square, the diagonal of a square, is always at that same tilt. Some people describe it as being 45 degrees, but every time I start getting into degrees and start thinking of too much geometry and too many numbers, something about that takes all the fun out of it. So, but for me, maybe not for you, but try this out. And like I say, that's just the main idea, is these 2 points. And if I imagined a right triangle that those 2 points would create, and then the other right triangle that they would create, thinking about, is that rectangle that I've ended up with a square, a little taller square, a little wider, how much? And what this is getting to is both using is the fact that any rectangle that I make that jives up with these verticals and these horizontals will be in proportion with each other. So that rectangle is the same proportion as that rectangle, and that, I could enlarge this. Any point along that diagonal line, or if I start here and go straight up to the diagonal and then straight across, now that rectangle is the same proportion as this one and this one, because they all share this diagonal. I'll get more into that in the next video and why that is important. But for now, I would just practice doing that. a little bit wider than 1 square. Let's see, how about... My 2 points were like that. They're pretty far from each other. I still want to imagine this first. I usually like that up-down. I'm usually a little bit better at imagining the vertical. So as I'm looking at this, I can tell that that's something's a little bit angled, kind of weird. And so I'm going to lean back and kind of judge it to the edge of my paper here, and judge this one to the edge of my paper here. See if this one seems like it's really straight across. That one's really straight up and down. And it's pretty doable to adjust to make sure that things are straight up and down or straight across. What is hard to do is if you're trying to just duplicate a line that is exactly that angle, and that is a great skill to have, but what is helping me more than trying to imagine this as a certain sort of number degrees of an angle, or this certain, if it was a clock, it was a certain hand of a clock, towards 2 o'clock or something like that. I'm having a lot better luck, especially when I start looking at really complex things where there's all sorts of different angles and all sorts of edges of things that are fighting and competing for my attention, and fighting to establish what is straight up and down and what is straight side to side gets very confusing, especially when you start getting into perspective. And this little idea here I have found to be extremely helpful, and I'll show you more about that related to, especially when you start getting into drawing structural forms and things that are box-like and that sort of stuff. But do that a million times and know there's no law that says you have to start with the higher point to the right. So that's more than 2 squares tall. That's more than 2 squares tall. That's more than in between 1 and 2 squares wide, in between 1 and 2 squares tall. Hopefully that's making sense. Okay. That is seriously more than 2 squares wide. More later.